The interrogation room smelled of rust and fear. Concrete walls sweated in the Afghan heat, and the single bulb overhead cast shadows that danced with every movement. 3 Taliban fighters circled the woman zip-tied to the metal chair, her flight suit torn at the shoulder, blood trickling from a split lip. They'd found her ejection seat 2 clicks from the burning wreckage of her FA-18 Super Hornet, the aircraft's tail section still smoking in the valley below. What they hadn't found yet was the respect that should have accompanied the discovery. American pilot, one of them sneered in broken English, backhanding her across the face. You cry now, yes. Lieutenant Commander Rivka Dalton didn't cry. She'd stopped crying the day her brother's flag-draped coffin arrived from Ramadi 14 years ago. She'd stopped showing fear the day she earned her trident. The SEAL insignia was still there, barely visible under the grime on her dog tags, an artifact from another life before she'd crossed over to naval aviation. Most pilots had one specialty. Dalton had been forged in 2 crucibles. They didn't know that yet. Where is base? Another strike, this one to her ribs. How many aircraft? Dalton's gray-green eyes tracked each man with the cold assessment of a hunter. The one asking questions wore a commander's scarf. The one by the door favored his left leg. Old wound probably, weight distribution all wrong. The third kept touching his Makarov like it was a security blanket, finger outside the trigger guard, amateur grip. She cataloged it all, building the tactical picture the same way she'd done in a dozen countries whose names never made the news. Nothing, the commander grabbed her jaw, forcing eye contact. You are very brave or very stupid. What Dalton was, precisely, was very patient. The zip ties were standard flex cuffs, maybe 40 pounds of tensile strength. Her wrists were already working them, subtle movements disguised by the shaking they expected from a terrified prisoner. Let them see the split lip and the torn flight suit. Let them see what they wanted to see. Another American pilot, fragile and afraid, waiting for rescue that might never come. Outside, she could hear the muezzin calling evening prayer. The sound echoed off the mountains, and somewhere beyond those peaks was Bagram, where her strike package would be returning without her. Her wingman, Khalsin Havoc, would be debriefing right now, voice probably shaking as he described the SAM launch, the way her Super Hornet had corkscrewed through the sky trailing fire, the parachute blooming white against the brown earth. They'd be planning a rescue, but rescue took time. Dalton didn't have time. Not with what she'd seen from the air before the missile hit, not with the convoy of technicals loaded with ordnance heading toward the valley where 2nd Battalion was dug in, unaware and undermanned. The intelligence had to get out, and there was nobody coming through that door who could do it but her. So she kept cataloging, kept planning, kept being what they couldn't see. The commander leaned close, breath hot against her face. Last chance, pilot, talk or we make you scream. Dalton smiled then, just slightly, just enough. You first, she said. The explosion that followed wasn't the one they expected. 18 hours earlier, the morning brief at Bagram had the usual energy of combat operations in year 12 of Forever War. Lieutenant Commander Dalton sat in the back row of the ready room, flight suit crisp despite the 4:30 wake-up, her helmet bag resting against worn boots that had walked through sand on 3 continents. Around her, the squadron's junior officers traded the kind of nervous jokes that came before complex missions into hot airspace. Heard the target package today is spicy, Lieutenant Harrison, Khalsin Joker, said from 2 rows up. Fresh-faced and 3 months into his first deployment, he still treated combat flights like a video game he was winning. Heavy SAM presence in the valley. That's why they send the professionals, his wingman replied, grinning, and also why they send Dalton to babysit you. The briefing officer, Commander Phillips, called the room to attention before Dalton could respond. The overhead projector flickered to life, casting satellite imagery across the front wall. The target was a compound in the Khyber Pass region, suspected weapons cache supporting Taliban operations. Standard strike mission, 4-ship formation, mixed ordnance package. Dalton, your flight lead, Phillips said. his tone carrying the weight of someone who'd read her jacket and knew exactly what those extra ribbons meant. "Harrison and Vale on your wing, Havoc flying chase." She acknowledged with a nod, already running calculations. The valley was a natural Sam Alley, mountains on three sides funneling aircraft into predictable approaches. Whoever had positioned those surface-to-air batteries knew air power tactics, knew how American pilots thought. This wasn't random insurgent defense. This was professional military planning. "Rules of engagement are standard," Phillips continued. "Positive ID required before weapons release. Intel suggests civilian presence in adjacent structures, so keep your targeting tight." After the brief, Dalton walked the flight line as dawn broke pink and gold over the Hindu Kush. Her Super Hornet, Bureau number 412, sat ready on the hardstand, ordnance loaded and pre-flight complete. The crew chief, a weathered master sergeant named Torres, handed her the aircraft logbook. "She's purring, Commander," Torres said. "All systems green." "Any word on those SAM updates?" Dalton asked, scanning the maintenance forms. Torres shook his head. "Intelligence is still processing satellite data from last night. They're saying the threat level is moderate, but you know how that goes." Moderate meant anything from outdated Stingers to modern Russian systems. Dalton had dodged them all at some point, but that didn't make the threat less real. Every flight into contested airspace was a negotiation with physics and luck had a way of running out when you stopped respecting it. She completed her walk around with the methodical attention that separated survivors from statistics. Leading-edge flaps, control surfaces, ordnance stations, everything exactly as it should be. The Super Hornet was a beautiful machine, all thrust and precision, the kind of aircraft that forgave small mistakes but punished arrogance. Dalton had been flying them for 6 years, ever since she'd made the transition from helicopters. Before that, before the wings and the altitude, there had been the water, the teams, the Trident. Nobody in the squadron knew about that part except Phillips, and he kept it quiet because having a former SEAL in your aviation unit raised questions that were easier left unasked. The Navy didn't advertise its crossovers, the operators who traded one kind of warfare for another. Dalton preferred it that way. She climbed into the cockpit at 6:15, strapping into the ejection seat with practiced efficiency. The canopy came down with a hydraulic hiss, sealing her into the familiar smell of jet fuel and electronics. Radio checks came back clean, and one by one the formation checked in. Bagram Tower, Falcon Flight requesting taxi clearance. Falcon Flight cleared to taxi runway 27. Winds light and variable, altimeter 3012. The Super Hornet rolled forward, 60,000 pounds of American engineering moving with deceptive grace. Dalton could feel the aircraft through the stick, the way a rider feels a horse, responsive and ready. Behind her, the rest of the flight fell into line, their aircraft gleaming in the early light. Takeoff was smooth, the runway falling away as the formation climbed into crystalline sky. Below, Afghanistan spread out in shades of brown and tan, ancient and unforgiving. Somewhere down there, people were waking up to another day of war they hadn't chosen, and somewhere else, people who had chosen this war were preparing defenses against the exact kind of strike package now heading their way. Dalton leveled at 28,000 feet, running through her systems one final time. Radar showed clear, but the mountains played hell with electronic surveillance. You never really knew what was waiting until you committed to the run. "Falcon Flight, push channel 7, she transmitted, switching the formation to the tactical frequency. The flight checked in sequentially, professional and crisp. These were good pilots, even Harrison with his youth and enthusiasm. They'd do their jobs. The question was whether the intelligence was good enough to keep them all alive while doing it. 30 minutes into the flight, that question started answering itself in ways nobody liked. "Falcon lead, Havoc. I'm picking up radar emissions, search pattern, bearing 270. Dalton checked her own threat display. The signal was there, intermittent but distinctive. SA-15 Gauntlet, Russian-made and professionally operated. This wasn't some Taliban shepherd with a stinger. This was a trained crew running an integrated air defense system. Copy Havoc, flight, maintain current altitude. We're going to loop north and come in from a different vector. She adjusted course, taking the formation wide of the expected approach. The compound was still 12 minutes out, and already the enemy was showing capabilities that didn't match the intelligence brief. Someone down there knew they were coming. The mountains rose ahead, jagged peaks catching the morning sun. Beautiful and deadly, like most things in this country. Dalton had learned to appreciate Afghanistan in the way you appreciate a worthy opponent, respecting its ability to kill you while refusing to let that respect become fear. Falcon Lead additional emissions, SA-6 system bearing 285. Now they had overlapping coverage, a layered defense that forced aircraft into kill boxes no matter which approach they chose. This was getting complicated. Flight hold current position. I'm going to take a look. Dalton pushed the stick forward, diving her Super Hornet toward the deck while the rest of the flight maintained altitude. She needed to see what they were dealing with, needed to understand the battle space before she committed her pilots to running the gauntlet. The altimeter unwound as she dropped through 20,000 feet, then 15, the mountains rising to meet her. At 8,000 feet she leveled off, hugging the terrain, using the valleys for cover. The threat receiver painted the sky with enemy radars, but down here in the weeds she was harder to track. She keyed her radio. Bagram Control, Falcon Lead. We've got heavy SAM presence in the target area. Request updated intelligence on enemy air defense network. Static then. Falcon Lead Bagram. Stand by for relay from Warrior TOC. She waited, holding position in a wide orbit while her wingmen circled above. The Super Hornet handled like a dream at low altitude, responsive and stable, but this close to the ground there was no margin for error. One moment of inattention and she'd be a crater decorated with titanium confetti. Falcon Lead, Warrior. Satellite imagery from 0300 shows possible SA-15 battery grid 927. Be advised, signals intelligence suggests professional operators, possibly Syrian or Iranian advisors. That changed everything. Advisors meant training, discipline, the kind of air defense tactics that had killed American pilots in other wars. Dalton pulled up hard, climbing back to altitude while her mind ran through options. They could abort, return to base and wait for SEAD assets to soften up the defenses. Or they could adapt, use tactics that professional operators wouldn't expect, exploit the gaps that always existed in even the best air defense networks. She chose adaptation. Abort meant the convoy would move, the intelligence would age, and 2nd Battalion would stay in the dark about the threat heading their way. Sometimes you had to take calculated risks because the alternative was letting good people die from ignorance. Falcon Flight, we're going in low and fast. Harrison Vale, you're going to draw their attention from the west. Come in hot at 12,000, make them light up their radars. Havoc and I will use the distraction to hit the compound from the southeast, terrain masking until weapons release. Copy Lead. Harrison sounded nervous now, the reality of professional enemy defenses cutting through his earlier confidence. Stay focused, stay aggressive, and if you hear missile launch warning, brake hard and deploy chaff. These systems are good, but they're not magic. We're faster and we're smarter. She hoped that was true. The next 20 minutes would tell the story. The flight split, Harrison and Vale breaking west while Dalton and Havoc dropped back into the valleys. The terrain rose around them, rock walls streaked with mineral deposits, the kind of landscape that looked primordial and probably was. Dalton flew on instinct and training, reading the ground ahead, anticipating the contours before they arrived. Falcon Lead Havoc, your 6 is clear. I've got good formation. Copy. Stand by for pop-up maneuver in 90 seconds. Her hands were steady on the controls, breathing regular despite the adrenaline singing through her bloodstream. This was what she'd trained for, what all those hours in simulators and red flag exercises had prepared her to do. Combat wasn't about being fearless. It was about being competent when fear tried to make you stupid. 60 seconds. The compound appeared on her display, 3 buildings in a triangular pattern, exactly as briefed. She armed her weapons, double-checking the targeting solution. The GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack munitions were already programmed, just waiting for her to designate and release. 30 seconds. To the west, Harrison and Vale were making their run, their radar signatures bright and obvious. Right on cue, enemy radars went active, multiple systems lighting up to track the approaching threat. Missile launch, Harrison's voice cracked with tension. Missiles in the air. Break left, deploy countermeasures. Dalton forced herself to stay focused on her own approach. Harrison had training and reflexes. Either he'd defeat the missiles or he wouldn't, and her looking over her shoulder wouldn't change that outcome. She had her own job to do. 10 seconds. She pulled back on the stick, popping up from the valley floor, the compound filling her heads-up display. Lock. Solution. Release. The GBU-38s dropped away clean, 2,000 pounds of precision-guided ordnance falling toward their target. Weapon away, Havoc, your turn. Weapons away. Dalton broke hard right, diving back toward terrain cover as her threat receiver screamed warnings. Sam launch, close, too close. She didn't think, just reacted, yanking the aircraft through a barrel roll while punching out chaff and flares. The missile tracking signature wavered, lost lock, reacquired. G-forces pressed her into the seat as she tightened the turn, grunting against the pressure, keeping blood in her brain through sheer muscular effort. The missile followed, relentless and fast, closing the distance with mathematical precision. Time slowed the way it always did in these moments. She could see the compound exploding below, Harrison and Vale egressing west with missiles still tracking them, Havoc somewhere behind her calling warnings she couldn't process. All of it compressed into a single moment of perfect clarity. The SA-15 had one weakness. It couldn't pull as many GS as a Super Hornet flown by someone willing to push the aircraft to its limits. Dalton was willing. She rolled inverted and pulled, the altimeter unwinding again as she dove toward the mountainside at 500 knots. The missile stayed with her, tracking, adjusting, but now they were both heading toward terrain and only one of them could turn. At the last possible second, when she could see individual rocks on the mountain face, Dalton pulled with everything she had. 9 GS. The world went gray at the edges. The aircraft shuddered, protesting, but it turned. The missile didn't. It impacted the mountainside in a flash of fire and fragmentation. Falcon lead is clear, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline crash beginning to shake her hands. Flight, sound off. Havoc clear and egressing. Vale clear. Silence from Harrison. Joker say status. More silence and then a transmission broken by static and stress. I'm hit. Hydraulics failing, I can't. I'm losing it, lead. Dalton rolled wings level, searching the sky. There, 2 o'clock low, a Super Hornet trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, the aircraft wallowing through the air with all the grace of a wounded bird. Joker, stay calm, what's your heading? I don't, controls aren't responding. I think I need to punch out. Negative, hold on. You're over hostile territory. If you can keep her flying, get some distance first. She moved into formation beside him, assessing the damage. The missile had clipped his tail section, tearing through the vertical stabilizers and hydraulic systems. That Harrison was still airborne was testament to the Super Hornet's redundancy and his own skill, but the aircraft was dying by degrees. I'm reading Bagram bearing 095, 60 miles, Dalton said. Can you make it? I don't know. Look at me, Harrison. She moved closer, close enough that he could see her through the canopy. "You're going to make it because you're a naval aviator and we don't quit. Trim it out, nurse your remaining hydraulics and fly this bird home." For 10 miles she stayed on his wing, coaching him through every adjustment, every compensation for failing systems. They crossed back into friendly airspace, the mountains falling away behind them, and still the damaged Super Hornet kept flying. Bagram Tower, Falcon Lead. "I'm bringing home a Code 3 emergency, severe battle damage, request priority landing." Falcon Lead, Bagram. "Cleared straighten approach runway 27, crash crews standing by." Harrison made the landing on fumes and determination, the Super Hornet touching down hard but intact. Fire trucks swarmed the aircraft as it rolled to a stop, and by the time Dalton landed 3 minutes later, Harrison was already out of the cockpit, sitting on the tarmac with his helmet off, shaking. She found him there after her own debrief, after the intelligence officers had confirmed the compound's destruction and the discovery of the weapons cache. He looked up when her shadow fell across him. "I froze up there," he said quietly. "When the missile launched, I just froze." Dalton sat down beside him, still in her flight suit, still smelling of jet fuel and sweat. "But you didn't stay frozen. You fought, you flew, you made it home. That's what counts." "You made me make it home." "No, I just reminded you what you already knew." She stood, offering him a hand up. "Come on, Joker. Squadron's buying the first round, tradition for your first SAM dodge." He took her hand, getting to his feet with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes yet. That would come later, after the adrenaline fully faded, and he realized he'd survived something most people only experienced in nightmares. What none of them realized, as they walked toward the ready room and the debriefs that followed, was that the mission had been compromised from the start. Someone had known the strike package was coming. Someone had positioned professional air defense crews exactly where they'd do the most damage, and someone had been watching to see what the Americans would do about it. That someone was now very interested in the pilot who'd led her flight through the gauntlet and brought them all home alive. Interested enough to start planning a very specific trap, one that would require very specific bait. 3 days after the compound strike, Lieutenant Commander Rivkad Dalton received new orders. Solo reconnaissance mission, low-level flight through the Khyber Pass region, routine surveillance of suspected Taliban supply routes. The mission profile was clean, the intelligence solid, and absolutely nothing about it felt right. She mentioned this to Commander Phillips during their pre-flight brief. "Your instincts are noted," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "But the tasking comes from higher up. They want eyes on those supply routes, and they want someone with experience flying low in contested airspace. Sir, with respect, this feels like bait." "Then don't bite." Phillips looked at her then, and she saw something in his expression that might have been apology or might have been resignation. "But fly the mission. We need the intelligence." She flew it because that's what pilots did. Even when their gut screamed warnings, their brain couldn't quite justify. The morning was clear. The Super Hornet performed perfectly, and the route through the Khyber Pass was exactly as boring as advertised for the first 40 minutes. Then her threat receiver lit up with a SAM launch signature she never saw coming. The missile rose from a covered position. No warning, no radar lock, just sudden activation and impact within seconds. Dalton had time to think heat seeker, and then her aircraft was tumbling through the sky, fire spreading through the port engine, controls sluggish and failing. "Mayday, mayday, Falcon Lead is hit. I'm losing hydraulics, fire in the port engine." She fought the aircraft, tried to nurse it toward friendly territory, but the Super Hornet was dying too fast. Ejection became not a choice but an inevitability, the altimeter unwinding through angels where survival meant trusting a parachute and luck. "Bagram Falcon Lead, I'm punching out." The ejection sequence was violent and instantaneous. The canopy blew, the rocket motor fired, and suddenly she was tumbling through open air while her aircraft spiraled toward Earth in a trail of black smoke. The parachute deployed with a crack that she felt through her entire body, and then she was floating in sudden silence, the war reduced to distant sound and the ground rising to meet her. She landed hard in a valley that smelled of dust and cordite, the parachute collapsing around her. Training took over. Cut the risers, get clear, assess the situation. Her survival radio was intact, her sidearm secure. She transmitted her position and started moving toward high ground. She made it 300 yards before the technicals arrived. 4 vehicles loaded with fighters who'd been waiting, who knew exactly where she'd come down. This wasn't luck. This was planning. They zip-tied her hands, threw her in the back of a pickup, and drove for an hour into mountains that got progressively more remote. Nobody spoke during the drive, but she could feel them watching her, assessing, making calculations of their own. The interrogation room was waiting, prepared in advance. Metal chair, concrete walls, the kind of setup that spoke to experience with captured prisoners. They'd done this before. Which brought her back to the present moment, to the zip ties and the blood, and the 3 men who thought they understood what they'd caught. The commander stepped back, nodding to the man by the door. Make her talk. What happened next happened fast. Dalton twisted her wrists, using the blood from her split lip as lubricant, feeling the zip tie give just slightly. Not much, but enough. She'd been working it for 20 minutes and now the moment arrived. The fighter approached, pulling a knife, probably planning to start cutting away pieces that wouldn't kill her immediately. She waited until he was close, until his attention was on the blade and not on her hands. Then she moved. The zip tie snapped. Her right hand shot up, grabbing his wrist, redirecting the knife toward his own throat while her left hand grabbed his weapon. The Makarov came free from its holster as she rolled backward over the chair, putting the now dying man between herself and the others. 2 shots sent her mass on the man by the door. He went down hard. The commander reached for his own weapon, but Dalton was already moving, closing the distance, using the knife she'd taken to open his throat before he could draw. He fell, gurgling, and the room went silent except for the sound of 3 men bleeding out on concrete. She zip-tied the commander's hands with his own cuffs before he finished dying, taking his radio and his sidearm. The room's single window was small but breakable. She kicked it out, checked the courtyard beyond. Clear for the moment. This was the easy part. The hard part was getting back to friendly lines with the intelligence she'd seen from the air, the convoy positions, the proof that someone had known exactly how to shoot her down. But hard had never stopped her before. She went through the window just as voices shouted alarm from somewhere in the compound. By the time they reached the interrogation room, she was already moving through the twilight, heading for the mountains, carrying secrets that were worth more than one pilot's life. The escape took 3 days and covered 40 miles of terrain that wanted to kill her as much as the enemy did. Dalton moved at night, hid during the day, and survived on training that predated her wings. The SEAL in her knew how to disappear, how to navigate by stars, how to become a ghost in hostile territory. The pilot in her knew time was running out, that the convoy was moving, that 2nd Battalion needed the warning she carried. On the 3rd day, she made contact with a recon patrol from the 101st Airborne. They found her in a ravine, dehydrated and exhausted but still armed, still moving. The patrol sergeant took one look at her flight suit and the blood on her hands and called for immediate extraction. The helicopter ride back to Bagram felt like returning from another planet. Through the window she could see Afghanistan passing below, the same mountains and valleys she'd flown over, but from a perspective that felt fundamentally different. She'd been prey here, hunted, and that changed something essential about how she saw the landscape. Commander Phillips met her at the landing zone, his expression carefully neutral. "The convoy?" she asked before he could speak. "2nd Battalion engaged them 6 hours ago. Heavy fight, but they were prepared. Intel Division wants to debrief you immediately. After I clean up. Dalton. After I clean up, sir. She walked past him toward the barracks, still carrying the commander's radio, the evidence of betrayal and coordination that spoke to threats bigger than one down pilot. Someone had set this up. Someone with access to flight schedules and mission parameters had sold her out. The shower ran hot, washing away 3 days of survival but not the questions that came with it. She stood under the water until it ran clear, then dressed in a fresh flight suit and went to tell intelligence officers about the network she'd uncovered, the communications she'd intercepted, the coordinates she'd memorized while bleeding in that interrogation room. The debrief lasted 6 hours. They asked the same questions different ways, testing her recall, cross-referencing her observations with satellite intelligence and signals intercepts. By the time they finished, the full picture had emerged. A coordinated effort to target American air assets, professional advisors training local forces, someone inside the wire feeding information to the enemy. "We'll investigate the leak," the senior intelligence officer said. "Meanwhile, you're grounded pending medical evaluation." "I'm fine." "You were shot down, captured, tortured, and spent 3 days in hostile territory. You're not fine, you're operational." He softened slightly. "Take the time, Commander. Process what happened. Nobody expects you to bounce back in 24 hours." But Dalton did expect it of herself, which was why she found herself back in the ready room at 400 the next morning, running through emergency procedures on the simulator, retraining muscle memory that had kept her alive. Harrison found her there, 2 hours into a session that should have ended 90 minutes ago. "You're supposed to be resting," he said. "I'll rest when I'm dead." She didn't look away from the displays, working through another SAM evasion scenario, this one with double the normal missile count. Harrison sat down in the wingman station, booting up his own console without being asked. "Then I guess I'd better practice too. Someone's got to keep you alive out there." They flew simulated missions until dawn, and when the rest of the squadron arrived for morning brief, they found Dalton and Harrison already suited up, ready to fly. Phillips pulled her aside before the mission brief. "You don't have to prove anything." "Not trying to prove anything, sir. Trying to stay sharp." "Is that what you call it?" He studied her face, looking for cracks she wouldn't show. "The flight surgeon cleared you, but medical clearance and operational readiness aren't always the same thing." "I'm ready." "I know you are. That's what worries me." He handed her a folder, classified markings visible on the cover. "New tasking came down last night. Hunter-killer mission, targeting the air defense network that shot you down. Command wants you to lead it." She opened the folder, scanning the mission parameters. 4-ship strike package, mixed SEAD and strike assets, going after the SA-15 batteries that had killed 1 Super Hornet and nearly killed 2 more. It was aggressive, dangerous, and exactly the kind of mission that made sense if you wanted to send a message. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow at dawn. That gives you today to brief your flight and run through scenarios." He paused. "Dalton, nobody would blame you for sitting this one out. You've earned the right to let someone else take the lead." "Respectfully, sir, they shot me down. This one's personal." "That's exactly why you shouldn't fly it." She met his eyes, and something in her expression made him step back. "Permission to speak freely." "Granted." "They beat me, bound me, thought they'd broken me. They were wrong. And now I'm going to show them exactly how wrong they were, with 2,000 pounds of ordnance delivered with precision and prejudice. That's not personal, sir. That's professional." Phillips considered this, then nodded slowly. "Brief your flight at 1400, and Dalton, bring them all home." "Always do, sir." The brief at 1400 was thorough and uncompromising. Dalton walked her pilots through every aspect of the mission, every threat, every contingency. She showed them the terrain maps she'd memorized during her escape, the positions she'd identified, the tactical picture that only existed because she'd survived to draw it. Harrison would fly her wing again, along with two more experienced pilots, Captain Reeves, Coulson Grimm, and Lieutenant Vasquez, Coulson Torch. Good pilots, steady hands, the kind of team you wanted when flying into integrated air defenses with intent to kill. The SA-15 batteries are positioned here and here, she indicated on the map. Overlapping coverage, professional setup. We're going to hit them simultaneously with AGM-88 harms, suppress their radars, then follow up with precision strikes on the launcher platforms. What about backup? Torch asked. If they've got professional advisors, they'll have backup systems. Which is why we're bringing our own backup. Dalton pulled up another slide, showing Wild Weasel aircraft and electronic warfare assets. Two F-16CJs will sanitize the approach corridor, while an EA-18 Growler jams their communications. We're not going in unsupported this time. The pilots asked good questions, technical and tactical, building their own understanding of the battle space. This was how professional aviators approached combat, with preparation, analysis, and the healthy respect for an enemy that came from understanding their capabilities. After the brief, Dalton walked the flight line alone, inspecting her aircraft as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Torres had her Super Hornet ready. A new bureau number since 412 was still scattered across an Afghan valley. This one was 437, fresh from depot maintenance and loaded for bear. She's a good bird, Commander, Torres said. Treated her special, knowing where you're taking her. What you do, sacrifice a chicken over the engine intake. Thought about it, settled for just checking everything twice. He handed her the logbook. Bring her back in one piece this time. That's the plan. Night fell over Bagram with the same indifference it fell everywhere, turning the air base into a constellation of lights against the dark. Dalton tried to sleep and failed, her mind running through the mission over and over, seeing threats and opportunities, calculating angles and timing. Finally, she gave up and went to the chapel, a small building near the base perimeter where people went to make peace with whatever they needed to make peace with. She wasn't particularly religious, but the quiet helped. She sat in the back pew, breathing in the silence, letting her mind settle into the calm she'd need for tomorrow. Other people came and went, offering prayers to gods who might or might not be listening, seeking comfort in ritual and faith. Dalton sought comfort in competence, in the knowledge that she'd trained for this, that her hands knew the controls and her mind knew the mission. Fear was acceptable, freezing wasn't, and she'd seen what happened when pilots froze. At 300, she returned to her quarters and managed 3 hours of sleep, the deep, exhausted kind that came from finally surrendering to the body's demands. When her alarm sounded at 600, she woke clear-headed and focused, ready. The morning brief was crisp. Weather good, aircraft ready, support assets in position. Commander Phillips wished them good hunting and stepped back to let her lead. At 7:15, 4 Super Hornets taxied toward the runway, their navigation lights bright against the dawn. Dalton ran through her final checks, the familiar rhythm calming her pulse. Throttles forward, engine instruments green, controls check. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and one by one the flight accelerated down the runway and into the sky. Afghanistan fell away below, already baking in the early heat. Somewhere down there, the men who'd shot her down were going about their morning routine, probably confident in their defenses, probably assuming the Americans would think twice before coming back. They were about to learn the cost of assumptions. Falcon Flight check-in. Havoc. Grimm. Torch. Copy all. Mission is go. Time to show these guys what happens when they pick a fight with naval aviation. The flight climbed to altitude, rendezvousing with their support aircraft over predetermined coordinates. The Wild Weasels took point, their sophisticated radar hunting systems already active, searching for enemy emissions. The Growler moved into jamming position, ready to blind enemy communications at the critical moment. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, which was when Dalton's instincts started screaming warnings. Grim, you picking up anything unusual on your threat display? Negative lead. Sky's clean except for expected SAM radars. Too clean, maybe. The enemy had been smart before, professional. Would they really just sit there broadcasting their positions, waiting to be hit? Or was this the same kind of trap they'd used on her solo flight, bait designed to draw in a larger force? Flight, I'm calling an audible. We're going to approach from the north instead of west, see if that changes their response. She altered course, taking the formation wide of the planned route. If this was a trap, the response would tell her. Professional air defense crews would adjust, reposition to maintain coverage. Random insurgents would probably stay put. 2 minutes into the new approach vector, the threat board lit up with new emissions. SA-6 systems, previously silent, now active and tracking. They'd been waiting, positioned to ambush aircraft coming from the planned direction. Flight sees it, Grim transmitted. They had us dialed in. Not anymore. Weasels, you have targeting solutions on those SA-6s. Affirm, Falcon lead, ready to engage on your call. Weapons free, light them up. The F-16s launched first, their AGM-88 harms dropping away and accelerating toward the radar emissions. The missiles were supersonic, riding the enemy's own transmissions down their throats. Impact came seconds later, the SA-6 radars going dark as their antennas exploded. Good hits, Falcon flight, we're going in. Havoc, you're with me on the eastern battery. Grim and Torch take the western position. The formation split, diving toward their targets while the Growler's jamming reached full power, turning the electromagnetic spectrum into chaos. Dalton pickled off her harms at the SA-15 battery, watching the missiles track true, then followed up with her strike ordnance. The valley erupted in fire and smoke as precision weapons found their marks. Secondary explosions indicated ammunition cook-offs, the batteries destroyed in the kind of overwhelming violence that ended air defense networks permanently. Splash 2 SAM sites, Dalton transmitted. Grim status. Western battery is destroyed. We're clear and egressing. Copy flight, let's go home. They climbed back to altitude, the mountains falling away behind them, and for the first time in days Dalton felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The mission was done, the threat eliminated, and all her pilots were coming home. At Bagram, Commander Phillips met them on the flight line with a smile that looked genuinely relieved. Intelligence confirms both battery locations destroyed. Good work. Harrison climbed down from his aircraft, his earlier nervousness replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced his fears and won. He caught Dalton's eye and nodded, no words needed. That night, the squadron bought drinks at the base club, toasting the mission and the pilots who'd flown it. Someone started telling stories, the kind that got embellished with each retelling, and gradually the conversation turned to Dalton's escape. I heard you killed 3 guys with your bare hands, Torch said. Technically, I used a knife and a pistol, Dalton replied, but who's counting? Were you scared? She considered the question, giving it the honest answer it deserved. Terrified, but fear doesn't mean you stop, it just means you keep going while scared. Harrison raised his glass, to going while scared. The squadron echoed the toast, and in that moment Dalton felt something shift. These weren't just fellow pilots anymore. They were her people, the ones who'd fly into hell on her wing because they trusted her to bring them home. That trust was earned through missions like today, through leading from the front and never asking anyone to take risks she wouldn't take herself. The celebration wound down eventually, pilots drifting off to rack or to other pursuits. Dalton found herself walking the flight line again, a habit she couldn't seem to break. Her Super Hornet sat on the hardstand, scorched from weapons release but intact. Tours would have it ready again tomorrow and the day after for as many tomorrows as the war required. She thought about the men in that interrogation room, the ones who'd thought binding her hands made her helpless. They'd seen the flight suit and the torn shoulder and assumed weakness. They'd died learning the difference between looking weak and being weak, a distinction that had saved her life more times than she could count. Being underestimated was a weapon all its own, one she'd learned to wield with precision. The night was quiet, the war temporarily distant. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, Afghanistan continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to American pilots and their missions. In a few hours, the sun would rise on another day of combat, another brief, another launch into contested airspace. But for now, standing on the flight line under stars that had witnessed countless wars, Lieutenant Commander Rivka Dalton allowed herself a moment of something that might have been peace. She'd survived. Her pilots had survived. The mission was complete. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to prove that the wings on her chest and the trident on her tags weren't decorations. They were promises, kept through blood and skill, and the refusal to quit when quitting would be easier. She turned back toward the barracks, leaving her aircraft to its rest. There would be time enough tomorrow to fly, to fight, to lead. Tonight was for sleeping the deep sleep of someone who'd done their job and done it well. Above, the stars watched in silence, bearing witness to the small dramas of humans at war, caring nothing for sides or causes or the outcomes of battles. They would still be shining long after this war ended, after the pilots and the aircraft and the air defense networks were all forgotten dust. But in this moment, under these stars, one pilot had proven once again that being underestimated wasn't the same as being defeated. And that lesson, written in fire and blood across the Afghan sky, was one the enemy wouldn't soon forget. The end came not with fanfare but with quiet recognition, the kind that matters more than medals. In the weeks following the SA-15 mission, word spread through the air wing about the pilot who'd been shot down, escaped, and come back to personally destroy the network that had targeted her. The story grew with each telling, acquiring details both true and embellished, until Dalton became something more than just another squadron commander. She became the standard others measured themselves against. Young pilots showed up at her briefs early, asking questions about tactics and survival. Seasoned aviators sought her opinion on mission planning, recognizing the experience that came from walking through the valley and climbing back out. Even the ground crews treated her aircraft differently, as if proximity to her competence might somehow transfer to their own work. Dalton handled the attention the same way she handled combat, with professional detachment and focus on the mission. She didn't need hero worship. She needed pilots who could think under pressure, who understood that survival was a skill set learned through preparation and maintained through discipline. "You're becoming a legend," Phillips told her one morning after a particularly complex mission brief. "The other squadrons are requesting you for their planning sessions." "I'm a pilot, not a mascot." "You're both, whether you want to be or not. That trident on your tags combined with your wings makes you unique. People want to know how you think, how you survived." "I survived because I had training and got lucky, in that order." "And you're too humble to recognize your own impact." He pulled out a folder, this one thicker than usual. New orders came down. They're rotating you stateside, assigning you to Top Gun as an instructor. The news landed like a gut punch. Leave the squadron, leave combat operations, go teach people theory instead of practice. It felt like a step backward, like being benched when she still had games to play. "I'd prefer to stay operational, sir." "I know you would, but the Navy needs instructors who have actually done the things they're teaching. You've got recent combat experience. You've survived situations most pilots only see in simulators, and you've demonstrated leadership under the worst conditions imaginable. That's what Top Gun needs." "When?" "2 weeks," Finish your current rotation, then transport back to Miramar. She wanted to argue, to make the case for staying with her pilots, but she could see the decision had been made above Phillips's pay grade. Sometimes orders weren't suggestions, and fighting them only damaged your credibility for the battles that mattered. Understood, sir. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of missions and farewells. Harrison gave her a plaque with her call sign engraved on it, a gesture that touched her more than she'd expected. Torres presented her with a piece of shrapnel from her destroyed Super Hornet, mounted and polished. The squadron threw a going-away party that was more subdued than rowdy, the kind of send-off given to someone who'd made a difference. On her last morning at Bagram, Dalton walked the flight line one final time. The sun was just rising, turning the mountains gold and pink, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the weight of leaving. This place had tried to kill her, had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, and somehow she'd emerged stronger. The flight back to the States took 30 hours, with stops and transfers and the strange dissonance of moving from war zone to suburban California in less than 2 days. Miramar felt surreal, clean and safe, and filled with people who'd never heard incoming fire. She reported to Top Gun's commanding officer, a captain who'd read her jacket and knew exactly what he was getting. "Welcome to Fighter Weapons School, Commander. Your reputation precedes you." "Hopefully the good parts, sir." "All parts. We need instructors who can teach from experience, not just theory. You'll be teaching air combat tactics, SCAD operations, and survival evasion. Your first class starts Monday." Teaching was different from flying, required a different skill set. Dalton had to learn patience, how to explain instincts that had become second nature, how to translate combat experience into lessons that would keep future pilots alive. Some days it felt like the hardest mission she'd ever flown. But gradually, she found her rhythm. She taught the way she flew, with precision, honesty, and an intolerance for shortcuts. Her students learned that excuses didn't defeat missiles, that survival required preparation, and that being underestimated could be tactical advantage if you were smart about it. One student, a cocky lieutenant named Bradford, challenged her during a debrief. "With respect, ma'am, that SA-15 evasion you're describing isn't possible. The numbers don't work." Dalton smiled thinly. "You're right, the numbers don't work if you're flying by the book, but combat isn't about following the book. It's about knowing which pages to rip out when your life depends on it." She pulled up gun camera footage from her mission, showing the missile tracking her, the terrain rushing up, the last-second break that defied physics and probability. 9 GS sustained, aircraft at structural limits, altitude margin of less than 50 feet. Possible. I'm standing here, so you tell me. Bradford shut up after that, and the rest of the class paid closer attention. Months turned into years. Dalton trained hundreds of pilots, each one carrying forward lessons written in her blood and experience. Some of them went on to combat deployments, came back with their own stories, their own close calls. A few didn't come back at all, which was the reality of the profession they'd chosen. She never mentioned her SEAL background unless directly asked, but word got around anyway. The students called her commander to her face and the SEAL pilot behind her back, usually with a mixture of awe and intimidation. She didn't discourage it. Intimidation kept them focused. 5 years into her Top Gun assignment, Dalton received a call from Harrison, now a lieutenant commander himself, leading his own squadron in the Pacific Fleet. They talked about missions and people, the usual shop talk, and then he said something that made her pause. "I wanted to thank you, ma'am, for that day over Afghanistan when I thought I was dead. You kept me in the fight, kept me flying. I've used those lessons to bring home pilots who might not have made it otherwise. You would have figured it out on your own. Maybe, but I didn't have to because you were there. That matters." After the call ended, Dalton sat in her office looking at the photos on the wall. Her SEAL team from years ago, faces young and serious. Her first squadron standing in front of their aircraft. Students from Top Gun, class after class, all of them carrying forward the knowledge she'd shared. This was legacy, she realized. Not the missions she'd flown or the enemies she'd killed, but the pilots she'd trained, the knowledge she'd passed on, the chain of competence that would continue long after she was grounded. She thought about those men in the interrogation room, the ones who'd seen her bound and bleeding and thought they'd won. They'd been wrong about what she was, wrong about what could be broken with zip ties and violence. The truth was simpler and harder to kill. She was what she'd always been. A warrior who happened to fly aircraft, trained by the best, tested by the worst, and still standing when the dust settled. That night, walking across Miramar's flight line under California stars, Dalton allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. The war continued without her, would continue after her, but she'd done her part. She'd led from the front, survived when survival seemed impossible, and taught others to do the same. Somewhere, a student she'd trained was flying into contested airspace, using tactics she'd shown them, trusting in lessons written in Afghan valleys and American classrooms. They would come home because she'd prepared them, or they wouldn't come home because war made no guarantees. Either way, they would know they'd been trained by someone who understood both the theory and the practice, who'd walked through fire and come back to describe the heat. That was enough. Years later, when historians and journalists would ask about Lieutenant Commander Rivka Dalton's career, about the missions and the escapes and the legend that had grown around her name, she would give them the same answer she gave her students. Competence isn't magic, survival isn't luck, and being underestimated is only an advantage if you're good enough to exploit it. She was good enough. The bodies she'd left behind, the pilots she'd brought home, and the students she'd trained all testified to that truth. And if sometimes, late at night, she still felt the zip ties on her wrists or heard the sound of missiles launching, well, that was the price of experience. You didn't walk through hell without carrying some of it back with you. The trick was making sure what you carried made you stronger instead of bitter. Dalton had chosen strength, every time. In interrogation rooms and cockpits, in classrooms and combat, she'd chosen to be what others couldn't break, what circumstances couldn't diminish. The wings on her chest and the trident on her tags weren't just symbols. They were proof that some people, when tested beyond normal limits, proved to be made of something harder than their enemies anticipated. The story of her shoot-down and escape would be told in ready rooms and training sessions for decades, details sharpening or softening depending on who did the telling. But the core truth remained unchanged. They bound her hands and beat her, thinking that would be enough. It wasn't enough. It would never have been enough. Because Lieutenant Commander Rivka Dalton was exactly what every enemy feared and every ally needed. A warrior who refused to quit, who turned obstacles into opportunities, who led from the front and brought people home. That was her legacy, that was her truth. And that, more than any mission or medal, was why her name would be remembered long after the wars she fought had faded into history.